Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. And we are taking a break from our current series for a very particular reason. Next week, 7th to the 13th of July, is the week of visibility for non-monogamy. This is a sort of a global thing, a week of action that aims to amplify non-monogamous voices, identities and experiences in order to dismantle stereotypes and promote acceptance. That is what that week is all about. And here at Living Out, we wanted to speak into that week and share the good news that the gospel brings into experiences of non-monogamy. And we have got a wonderful opportunity to do that because our very own Andrew Bunt has written a fantastic short little book, pamphlet. What do we call it? Do we call it a booklet, a pamphlet? Andrew, what do you think?
I think booklet. Pamphlet sounds quite archaic to me. Booklet.
Yeah, that's okay. Archaic. So booklet sounds much more exciting and new. Andrew has written in the wonderful Grove Ethics series a booklet called Three or More, Reflections on Polyamory and Consensual Non-Monogamy. And so the great news is that as this week happens, and as perhaps we as Christians think, what should our response be? Andrew is here to help us think through what a response should be. And he's also written a booklet to help you. And obviously there'll be a link to that booklet and where you can get hold of it in the show notes. I hope that's whetted your appetite for the rest of this episode. But before we get going, we have, of course, our banter moment. I slightly suspect that there might be people around the world that just listen to this podcast for the banter moment, particularly now that we have asked our listeners to provide us with the banter questions. We were saying just before we press record that the banter questions have gone up in quality and also in how challenging they are since we asked listeners to send them in. And this is the latest submitted by a listener. Is it okay to eat a kiwi like an apple? Is it okay to eat a kiwi like an apple? Let's start with that. And I think, well, Andrew Bunt, you're our sort of celebrity booklet writing guest, so you need to go first. What's your view on this?
I don't know. It's one of those things you think you've never think to ask it till you're asked it, and then you think, oh gosh, what a question. The first thing that came to mind to me was all things are lawful but not all things are helpful. And I think ethics might say you can eat a kiwi like an apple, but I'm not sure wisdom does.
Okay, you are basically taking the sort of approach that might mean that the Grove Ethics series asks you to write a booklet on the ethics of kiwi eating.
Any publisher listening, I'm always open to book contracts, yes.
Okay, well, there we are. That is an exciting prospect. Ashley, what about you? Is it okay to eat a kiwi like an apple?
I don't know if I can follow Andrew's biblical, theologically convinced answer, but my conviction is absolutely not, unless, well, I tend to peel apples. I don't like apple peel. So if that's what you're doing to a kiwi, then yes, just eat the inside. Don't be eating the furry thing on the outside. Please don't do that.
I mean, that's the thing. Can you imagine the furriness kind of sticking to your mouth and stuff? That's just horrible, right?
We see, I eat a kiwi like an egg, a boiled egg.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so you take the top off and then you which is obviously the best way of doing it.
What do you use for soldiers with a kiwi? What type of sort of melon soldiers with a kiwi?
Don't think they quite have the strength. Anyway, okay, this is illustrating how good that question was, the danger it could take up a whole episode. Andrew's already writing a Grove Ethics booklet on it. I think we better leave it there, but thank you so much, dear listener, who sent in that question.
Fabulous. Andrew, we're going to ask you a lot of questions over the next half hour or so. So here is our first one. What is polyamory and consensual non-monogamy? What are we talking about?
A good starting point, yeah. So polyamory, here's how I try and explain that, summarise that. Polyamory refers to emotionally, romantically, and often sexually intimate relationships between three or more people with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved. So the key thing here is these relationships are more than just two, that there's something emotional, romantically intimate, and usually it is sexually intimate as well, although people are often keen to point out it's not just about sex, it's about love as well. And the really, really key thing is that there's the consent and the understanding and the knowledge of everyone involved. So that's where this isn't just kind of someone going off and having an affair or cheating or committing infidelity. Actually, people all aware of it. And so it's poly, as in many, and Marie, love, kind of a loving, potentially romantic sexual relationship between many people. And then consensual non-monogamy is kind of a broader category that is a bit more focused on sexual relationships. And it's kind of a broad term for any sexual relationship where those involved agree the relationship isn't exclusive between just them. So, for example, or the most famous example would be an open marriage. Two people who are married to each other, but they are both in agreement with the fact that they can both then engage in other sexual relationships as well. And so consensual non-monogamy may be just a sexual thing. There may not be emotional connection involved, whereas polyamory tends to include the emotional romantic element as well. And in a sense, polyamory sits within and under the broad umbrella of consensual non-monogamy.
Thank you. Are these common kinds of relationships? Like, why is this something that people who are listening are actually going to come across in their day-to-day lives?
Well, I think the reality is increasingly so, and therefore it's increasingly likely we will come across this. It's really hard to know in a sense how common it is. I mean, how would you actually do that? There's not much research out there. The best research I could find when writing the book actually came from 2012, so admittedly quite a while ago in the US. And what was really striking about that research is it showed that actually the practice of consensual non-monogamy was more common in 2012 in the States than all the number of people who identified as LGBT, which is really striking. And actually the kind of view is that research was probably underestimating that at the time, and it's probably only continued to grow. So the numbers basically are probably considerably higher than we might imagine. And some UK stats, a survey a few years ago found that 39% of adults in the UK think humans aren't naturally monogamous, and 34%, so just over a third of people, think that polyamory is morally acceptable. So certainly there's kind of a level of practice of it and a growing level of acceptance of it. But what I think is maybe most striking, and why I really wanted to think about this and get people to think about this, is the fact that polyamory is now starting to pop up kind of everywhere. And I expect many of us listening, many of us are aware that we see it in popular media, online, even in politics. So think of the UK. This year, I think it is, Channel 4 have had a programme called Open House, the Great Sex Experiment, which is couples exploring the possibility of opening their relationship to other people. A similar thing in the UK, the US last year, there was a show called Couple to Thruple. Again, couples thinking, shall we introduce someone else into our relationship? You see it in kind of TV dramas and film as well. So Bridgerton, the really famous, really popular Netflix series, in season 3, released last year in 2024, there was a throuple in that. Even in my beloved West End, the Theatre District, in the Garrick Theatre earlier this year, there was a play called Unicorn, which was, again, a couple considering, shall we introduce someone into this relationship? And so we're seeing it in film, with TV shows, among the characters there. We're seeing celebrities increasingly talk about it as well, either about their own experience of polyamory or consensual non-monogamy, or just expressing an openness to it and a view that it's okay. And even actually now we begin to see it impact kind of policy level stuff. So in California and in some places in Canada, there are now various laws being rolled out to recognise polyamorous relationships. So, for example, you can have multi-parent families where a child can be born and there can be more than 2 people, there can be 3 people on the birth certificate. Actually, there can be the 3 parents to this child because they are in a polyamorous family. And so increasingly, I think we're just seeing all this evidence all over the place that it is becoming more common, that views are changing. And because it's so prominent in the media around us like that, that's usually one of the things that then precipitates social change. So chances are that actually there'll be a snowballing now of wider acceptance of this because of that. And so really that's, I think, why I think we should care. The reality is this is already here. I think it is a reality around us already. It's going to grow almost without any doubt. I think it will grow quite quickly because there's not many reasons for a secular person to object to it. Once they get over their initial kind of sense of this is a bit odd, even they might have an initial sense of kind of distaste for it, once they realise, actually, I don't think it does any harm, they're likely just to say, well, who am I to say this is wrong? And if it's growing, that means it is going to hit our churches, and especially hit our young people first, probably. They'll hear about it first, they'll think about it first. And so my real heart is I want us as Christians to be kind of ready and ahead of the curve. And rather than in 10 years' time thinking, oh, this has become a really widely practiced or widely accepted thing in society. Oh gosh, what do we think about this? Actually thinking now. So as we do encounter it, as we're living in a world, as we're seeking to disciple people, especially young people in a world that increasingly will be supportive of this, we can know what God says and can communicate that in faithful and also in compassionate kind of gospel-filled ways as well.
A lot of TV dramas, as you pointed out, that it used to be edgy, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago to have a gay kiss or a gay sex scene, when now it's a threesome or a throuple. That's now the edgy thing that people do. And that gets them quite a lot of publicity. And so I presume that's what they're doing. But it is really interesting, just that transformation over the last 10, 15 years. Nobody's going to report about the gay kiss or the gay sex, but they are perhaps going to talk a little bit more about the sort of things you've been mentioning.
Yeah, I remember when I went to university, 15 years ago. That's a horrible number. I met a girl who told me she was in a polyamorous relationship, and I had no idea what that meant. I had to go away and Google, and she was actually writing a blog, so I was reading things on her blog to just try and understand what on earth was going on in this relationship. Whereas I think if I was talking to the people in my youth group now, I would not have to explain to them what a polyamorous relationship was, exactly as you've described. It's just, even just the awareness culturally that we have is far increased, and the examples in the media, all that kind of thing. Andrew, how do you think we've got here? Why is this a trend that we're seeing increase?
I think there's lots of things. And I do think in some ways it is unsurprising and it's been almost inevitable. Even though to lots of us, it's kind of like, how on earth is this happening? How do we get here? But I think there are lots of things, and I explore this in more detail in the book, and I won't kind of outline it all here, but I'll talk about two things I think are really prominent. One is, I think it's just an inevitable outworking of shifts we've gone through as kind of, I guess, modern Western culture in our views on sex. One of the biggest, if not the biggest shift that's happened in the last 100 years is the way that sex is being separated from procreation. It's actually one of the big driving forces behind the whole kind of sexual revolution and changes in cultural views on sex and relationships is that sex and procreation are being separated. Because we now have pretty effective contraception, because abortion is very easily available, sex doesn't now so often, or doesn't have to, result in the production of a child. And therefore sex becomes very different. Not something that's potentially really costly and really, in a sense, high risk where you need to commit to someone. It becomes, in a sense, quite cheap. It becomes just a bit of fun. And of course, actually, if sex is very much about the production of children, it's very much a thing between two people. It only takes, and you can only involve two people in the creation of a child through sex. Actually, once that's taken out, why should actually a sexual relationship or romantic relationship be limited to two? So I think that shifting sex is one thing that has kind of gradually dripped down to this point. But also just the fact that sex has become so central to our conception of and our view of human experience, that actually sexuality has become core to senses of personhood, senses of self, and sexual expression has become core to ideas of well-being and flourishing, all kind of part of what we call expressive individualism, the idea that my desires are individual to me and they're good, and that embracing and expressing my desires is the route to flourishing. And therefore it's just not surprising that people are finding, actually, you know what, I've got a sexual romantic desire for lots of people. Why shouldn't I be true to myself? Why shouldn't I engage in that? So I think one area would be changes of perspectives around the understandings of sex. And then another one, which kind of goes in partnership, and I always want to talk about this one because I think it's one we think of less obviously. I think actually shifts in our understanding of, particularly our practice of friendship actually is really relevant here. The reality is friendship, the practice of close friendship has significantly declined in recent decades and over the last century or so. We know there's this huge kind of loneliness epidemic, there's this great kind of drought, as it were, of meaningful friendship. And I think what lots of people are finding is that they have this inbuilt need and desire for genuine human connection and intimacy. And even those in loving, healthy, romantic sexual relationships or marriages with one other person find they've got more relational needs can be met by that one person. And where I want to go big, yes, of course you do, because you're made for relationship with others and friendship as well, and with God. Actually, our culture has so devalued friendship that it doesn't see friendship as a potential answer to fill that longing we have for connection and intimacy. And our culture has become so sexualized, where intimacy equals sex, that you have a desire for intimacy. Friendship obviously isn't going to cut it, because friendship, well, what's the point in that? Intimacy must mean sex, therefore that void must be filled by a sexual relationship. And so I think actually in part, polyamory is being looked at unknowingly as a solution to the decline of friendship and the gaping void that's left in so many people's lives and hearts. And that I think both explains what's happening, but also begins to point us to some of the things we can do and ways we can respond, and the importance basically of us engaging with, thinking about friendship and meaningfully practicing friendship.
I remember a few years ago now listening to an interview with Willow Smith, who's the daughter of Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, where she was talking about like she wanted to be in a polyamorous relationship. And I remember her talking in those kind of terms you've just described, of one person can't meet all of my needs, and it's not fair of me to expect one other person to do that, in which I think she was completely right. But then, exactly as you've described, Andrew, rather than going, so I need a network of rich friendship, the solution that she saw was, well, I need to be in a polyamorous relationship because intimacy is found through those kind of sexual romantic relationships.
I think it's a really common view, and I don't want to jump the gun too much, but it does point us towards where we can start connecting with people. Both of us there are giving examples, and we said there's a bit we agree with. And that's so helpful. We first want to connect with someone and say, yeah, we all agree about this. We've got different ideas of how this works. And here's why I think actually the kind of secular narrative idea doesn't work. But here's what I think is God's better story where it does work. And one of the things I always want to point out with a topic like this is, for all of we can say, and I think it's true, there are sinful elements of things that are going on. So often we know sin is driven actually by looking for good desires but in the wrong places. And that's really important in terms of our heart posture in this, our heart position. So as you're really thinking, how have we got here? I don't think the Christian response is, well, everything's just going to pot and people are just really fundamentally 100% evil and people are trying to tear apart the fabric of society. And there are a few people trying to do that. And we are all thoroughly corrupted by sin and with evil desires inside of us. But also so often we run after sin because of good desires. We're actually just looking in the wrong place. And that just helps us to be a bit more compassionate, a bit less kind of scared of culture around us, a bit less scaremongering about culture, I think, as we think about what's going on.
You're listening to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. For more stories, resources and events, visit our website at livingout.org.
Andrew, this is at one level all very interesting, but why does this actually matter? Can't people do what they want as long as it's consenting? So often we've said on this podcast, and people are aware that the only sexual ethic is consent now in many people's minds. Why does this matter at all?
Which is exactly the question, lots of people are asking, or I think aren't yet asking, but as I said earlier, once they get over their initial kind of shock and maybe even kind of disgust and confusion about the idea, that's exactly what they're going to ask. And I think the answer we give as Christians is we just got this so much bigger, better, richer, deeper vision of what sexuality is about. The culture thinks sex is just about a potentially physical, potentially pleasurable physical activity. So if everyone's consenting and happy, everything's fine. Actually, we say, no, the Bible shows us sex is about so much more. It's meaningful, it's purposeful. Ultimately, sex is about Christ and the church. And that beautiful vision we talk about all the time here at Living Out, that sex and marriage, the relationship sex is meant to be reserved for, is meant to be about portraying around us these little pictures, these little dramatizations of the future eternal relationship between Christ and the church. A committed, deeply intimate, eternal union between two, mirrored in the committed, deeply intimate, lifelong union of marriage. And we often talk about how the fact that the Bible's teaching that sex and marriage are these pictures of Christ and the church are the reason why actually sex is the union of a man and a woman, why it wouldn't be appropriate for us to pursue relationships with someone of the same sex. But it's also, we might overlook, the reason why marriage is by definition the union of two. Because this is a picture of Christ and the church uniting together. Christ and the church are two. The church is one corporate whole, marrying Christ, two uniting together. And so it's the same reason we say marriage is between a man and a woman, is why we say marriage is between two people, because marriage and sex are about telling this story. And if we distort that picture, if we change the picture, we're not telling the story accurately. And also Christians should just really care because Jesus confirms this is his understanding of marriage and sex. It's really interesting when he's talking to the Pharisees about divorce and remarriage, he's being quizzed about them. He quotes from Genesis 2:24, the Bible's famous definitional statement of marriage. What's really significant is he quotes not actually the Hebrew version, but the Septuagint, the Greek translation that was around by then, which adds in the word two. It says the two shall become one flesh. It's like Jesus deliberately chooses to use the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew because it would clarify that word. Jesus himself, from his own mouth, says marriage is a union of two. As Christians, we can't get beyond that. We believe that's good news, so therefore we want to be able to communicate that well to the world around us.
Okay, whenever we talk about marriage as being two people and the sort of stuff you said at a Living Out event or probably elsewhere, immediately somebody comes back and goes, you don't seem to know your Bible. There are loads in the Old Testament. You go back and so many of the sort of figures in the Old Testament were in well, if not polyamorous, certainly polygamous relationships. They had more than one wife, certainly more than one sexual partner. So, aren't there examples? If you are a polyamorous person, can't you go to the Bible and say, I'm just like Abraham, I'm just like David, I'm just like Solomon?
Feels like the kind of slam dunk argument, doesn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's presented that way. Various things we can say there. One is it's worth noting, firstly, that argument is majorly overplayed in the sense of there are polygamous relationships in the Old Testament. There's actually not a lot of them. And it's almost always only high-status people. It doesn't seem to be that the everyday Israelite was practicing polygamy, which is an interesting starting point to realise. But the key thing we've got to ask with any story in Scripture is this descriptive, telling me what was happening, or is it prescriptive, telling me what should happen? And we shouldn't always jump to the assumption because something's happening in the Old Testament, obviously it's how things should be. And there are very good reasons to suggest that actually these stories of polygamous marriages in the Old Testament are not prescriptive. They're not how things should be. Particularly, every single one has really negative consequences from the fact it is a polygamous marriage. That is the authors telling us subtly in their ways, in their narrative, this is not a good thing. It's not how things are meant to be. We know from Genesis 1 and 2, the kind of setting up of the story is not how things are meant to be. So when we then see the negative consequences in the story, we're meant to understand these guys are making a serious mistake and actually are kind of reaping the conclusions and reaping the outworkings of that. And what's interesting actually is very few people today who are modern supporters of polyamory will actually bring up the Bible's portrayals of polygamy in defense of the practice, because actually they rightly noticed they were almost always, or they were always, one husband, multiple wives, polyandry. They were imbalanced, sometimes actually abusive relationships, so they're not a good modelling in a sense for modern relationships. So although people think it's a slam dunk to the biblical argument, it's not actually an argument used much to support relationships today. There are then also laws, just worth saying, most of which are case laws, so it's not saying here, have polygamous relationships. It's when people have done that, which they shouldn't be doing, here's what to do, particularly in that context to protect vulnerable people, children and the women involved. And really interestingly, Leviticus 18:18 actually may be a direct prohibition on polygamy. I think it is actually. There's kind of debates and complexities around the translation, but I think there's very good reason to think that it is. And when I wrote the Grove booklet, I basically realised this is a huge, big topic all in itself, and I need to do a bit more work in it. And so alongside the booklet, I released an article on our website called What About Old Testament Polygamy, where I go through all the examples and the different types of material and engage with a load of scholarship to try and show actually no, the Old Testament is really clear. Marriage is between two people. So anyone who wants to really unpack that question, that article on our website will be helpful to that. Obviously, we'll stick that in the show notes.
Brilliant, Andrew. Thank you so much. And just thanks for doing all this work for us. Really appreciate it. And yeah, really grateful. Okay, some people might be listening and thinking, well, this is just another case of, something happens in the world around us and we all get our smelling salts out and we're appalled by it and shocked. And we're just sort of, that's what we're doing. We're doing an episode where we can shock other Christians with something else that's going wrong in the world around us. I hope people who've listened to the Living Out podcast for a while know that that's not our method of doing things. How should we respond to this as Christians? What are we at Living Out? How are we at Living Out encouraging people to respond?
My starting point is always actually to encourage us to think about ourselves and our heart attitudes first. I think so often we can rush to what should I say, what campaign should I join, how do I do this and other. And actually, we look out before looking in. And I think the starting point is looking at our heart attitude towards this. Particularly, as you just said, some Christians, in a sense, actually will respond in kind of panic or in quite ungracious, ungentle, unsensitive ways. And so thinking about our own hearts and particularly cultivating an attitude of humility, recognizing that actually, yes, okay, we're talking about forms of relationship that fall outside of God's will, but actually recognizing, well, all of us are tempted and all of us fall short of God's ways. We've no right to feel pride or to be judgmental towards others. And starting from that position actually of I'm a sinner saved by grace, therefore invited to share that message of grace with others who are also sinners is really important. But also I think our heart attitude of hope. I worry sometimes that people look around at Western society, Christians look around and think, gosh, there is no hope and everything's falling apart. And this is the next thing. Oh, look what's happening now. Now they're doing this in sex and relationships. And we can feel a bit hopeless. And I just want to say, no, we can have hope. And we can particularly have hope because the gospel really does save. God loves to seek and save people from all kinds of situations and backgrounds, from all kinds of activity that falls out of line with his plans. And so we can have hearts that have real hope. So I think starting with heart attitudes, cultivating humility, building in ourselves or asking the Holy Spirit to pour into us hope, actually, of what God can do. And then thinking more kind of practically, more pastoral, really. And there's loads that we could say and loads that we could do, but things that I've reflected on is the importance of us setting an example, us living out God's plan. I think actually having us as Christians as a whole, as these kind of living witnesses to the goodness of God's plan, to the fact that actually there are quite tight parameters, but the parameters which lead to flourishing is so important. So we can point to that. And so actually we need people flourishing in two-person marriages. We need people flourishing in celibate singleness to point to as examples showing that God's plan works. We need, of course, especially as churches, to talk about and to teach about God's plan, not just the what, do this, don't do this, but as we're always saying at Living Out, the why. Why is it God says this, and why is this good news for all of us? How's it pointing us to Jesus? And I do think that church leaders especially need to start thinking through some of their pastoral questions. What are you going to do when actually you've got three people in front of you saying that they are living together, they are a throuple together, and they want to join your church? What are you going to do when actually you find out that there's a married couple in your church, they're now in an open marriage, and they are serving in this team or leading that group? What are you going to do? And we don't think through every situation, but we need to think through a bit actually and be ready and equipped, ready for the reality that pastoral questions are going to come. And that won't be anything we're not equipped for, because actually all these things ultimately fall into the general parameters of discipleship and all the stuff we know already. But thinking it through in relation to a new topic can be just, I think, a kind of helpful starting point to do that. And that's something I think we've all got to, in our own context, think through the challenges we might face and how in those can we hold together, here's the truth of God's word, and here also is an expression of his love, his mercy, his compassion as we seek to engage with people and to love them well.
Yeah, and it's just, thinking back to what Ashley said earlier about, friend at university saying she was in a polyamorous relationship, and then the evangelistic opportunities, and actually how we can, just touching on some of what we said in response to this, there are things that we can agree with in the sense of we are never going to, none of us are going to find the one other person that's going to satisfy us. We've been created to be in a network of relationships. There's some bridge building we can do in conversations with people who are yet believers, but who are in polyamorous relationships, isn't it? There's stuff we agree with, even if we think they've found the wrong solution to a problem they've discovered that we would say is a problem in society today.
I think polyamory is a form of relationship and just cultural shift, which is a particular opportunity for the gospel to bring answers. I really do think it is emerging from quite understandable context and legitimate needs and desires. And that is a wonderful thing for us to bring in. So actually, what if this is the solution? And I think both for us actually to encourage and to lead by example in a real new flourishing of friendship, but then even more actually that our relational needs obviously are pointing beyond any human relationship. And I think, all the kind of shifts in sexual ethics and relational practices we've seen in recent decades, this is the one where the opportunity maybe is kind of most obvious and slightly most easiest to grab actually. And so it's another reason I want to get Christians talking about it, so we're feeling equipped for that, actually ready to take those evangelistic opportunities and to show the goodness of God, rather than kind of looking back and thinking, I wish I'd known this 5-10 years ago better to do that, because I want to be in faith that actually God can really use us in this to bring his goodness and bring the gospel to people around us.
And I love actually that's the way that you end the book or end the booklet, 3 or more, is with that really positive message of hope. So I'm actually going to read out the last paragraph of your booklet. You point out that Christians have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to show and declare to our culture a better way of doing human relationships, the way that is both right and good. And equipped with the gospel, we can bring this good news to those around us, not with judgment and harsh treatment, but with love and humility. May we be those who bring such good news to the world around us. I love everything about that, but not just the last paragraph, but that last paragraph and that message of that hope, a message of hope and humility, which you've just shared with us, is so powerful. We need to pause there. If you do want to find out more, can I thoroughly recommend Andrew's Grove booklet, 3 or More. Thank you so much for joining us. All the resources we've mentioned will, of course, be in the show notes. Thanks for being part of this one-off episode. We'll be back to our series, answering your questions when a podcast next drops from Living Out. And the questions this time are going to be focused in questions about parenting, which I imagine will be a particularly good episode. But for now, thanks for joining us, and look forward to enjoying your company on a Living Out podcast sometime very soon.